Ready.
So the subject of this interview is Dr. Perkins, and today's date is January 20th, 2012. This interview is being conducted at Rivers Edge Academy and is part of the Civic Voices International Democracy Memory Bank project. Dr. Perkins, would you please affirm that you have signed the deed of gift authorizing the Memory Bank project to make this interview available to future researchers?
Yes, I have, and happily so.
Thank you. Now we will begin with our first question. Can you tell me about the community that you lived in during your childhood?
Yes, I lived in two communities that were really significant for me. I was born in Seattle, Washington, West Coast, of course, and I lived with my grandmother for a while my mother and father and siblings were out in the country. The country at that time was Renton, Washington. And so I got to be in the context of my grandmother's home and her friends, and she had a very big influence on my life. Seeing who she was, her leadership in the community was very formative. And the family left Seattle when I was about 5 years old, actually on my 5th birthday. Now, this was a long time ago. This was 1943, I think it was, that I left Seattle with my family. Part of the family had gone there a little earlier. And so we initially went to the central area of Los Angeles. This would have been, I forget the exact location now, but more or less the urban outer ring of Los Angeles. And I grew up in Compton, Willowbrook, Watts. So we moved to Compton, Willowbrook, Watts from a more downtown area when I was maybe 6, 7 years old. And there I encountered much diversity. Essentially, this was a Latino, African-American community with some Asians, Japanese, and Chinese. And so I grew up in a context where my closest friends actually my closest friends were Latino and Chinese. And so this was a very important formative period for me.
So you mentioned that you moved from Seattle, Washington to Los Angeles, California?
Yes, that's right.
Who made that decision?
The family did, in part, my father's health, so that was a factor. He was asthmatic and had a lot of allergies, and so being in a warmer climate was much more agreeable. So that was a factor. And he had been in the U.S. Cavalry, actually horses in those days. He was in the 9th Cavalry, the organization or company called the Buffalo Soldiers. So that's also a very historic company of Army cavalry people. And so when he came to Los Angeles, he was a saddle maker. And so he made saddles and he made harnesses for horses and so forth. He was an expert in that. And also he was a very good rider, and he did the rodeos, so he would do stunt riding and so forth. So California was really very agreeable. And the reason I mentioned the saddle making is he started in a upholstery shop because of his skills, and later he got a job also with the Southern California Freight Line making tarps, tents for the trucks. So instead of shipping things by train for the most part, they were using trucks, and he made the tarps, the tarps that would cover the trucks. So that brought us to California. And so I had older brothers, 5 older brothers and a younger sister. And so my sister and I, in particular, she was a year younger than me, we did our growing up years through high school in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area. More specifically, what is now called South Central. Then this would have been Compton and Willowbrook.
What high school did you go to?
I went to St. Anthony High School, St. Anthony Boys high school. And it was a Catholic school in Long Beach, California. And there was also, on the same compound, they had the girls' high school. So the boys went to one building and the girls went to another building. They had a few classes in common, like typing. So I went to the girls' building when I was learning how to type. And there were some other few classes that they might have had in common. But for the most part, they had a separate education. I was educated by a group of men who belonged to a religious order, a Catholic order of brothers. They were the Brothers of Holy Cross. They are the folks who are at Notre Dame University, and the girls were at, I think that was called Sacred Heart. Their school name was different from ours, even though it was on the same location. And so they had the sisters, we had the brothers. I ran cross country in high school. I did a little track, but I wasn't very fast. Cross country required endurance, and I had endurance. So cross country was what I did. And also band, but I was not good at music. I always wanted to be good at music, but I was in the band, and so they had someone there who could give an additional person to be in the marching band.
So you went to a Catholic high school?
Yes, I did.
Would that make you a religious man?
Yes, I grew up with a very significant religious orientation. My best class was always religion, and that started from a very early age. So my mother was very Catholic. She was a woman from Louisiana, French-speaking. Her grandmother was from France, and so Catholicism was very important in the family. And so Catholicism became a major part in my life, and I actually joined that order of brothers. And I was a brother of Holy Cross for 13 years. I went to Notre Dame for my undergraduate study. Then I went to Bangladesh as a missionary, and I was in Bangladesh 5.5 years continuously as a missionary. So I was there from 1962, March of 1962, until July 1969. And if you recall something of your history, 62 to 69, a lot was happening in the civil rights movement in the United States. And prior to that, I started my college in 1957. And of course, that was also a significant period in the civil rights movement. This is when President Eisenhower sent troops into Montgomery, Alabama. And that was a very big event at that time. So there's, during that period for me, I was away from 62 until 68 in Bangladesh. And what happened during that period? The president was assassinated during that period, FDR. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. That was a very significant period.
So would you consider yourself lucky that you got away from all of that, or would you wanted if you had the chance, would you have taken a part in the civil rights movement?
I would have taken part in the civil rights movement. I came, and that has been a regret. Yeah, so it's mixed feelings, okay? It's mixed feelings. Had I not, at the time that I joined the brothers, had I not joined the brothers, I would have joined the Marines. So when I was in high school, at the end of high school, I was trying to make a decision on whether to join the Marines or join the brothers. And I got some counseling at my school and decided I would go to the brothers. Now, what's significant about that? I probably would have been dead now, just because of my personality. I would have been made, no doubt, I would have been made a lieutenant, no doubt. I don't doubt that at all. And I would have been a gun-ho type of person, and my life would have been very short. So there's a kind of mixed feelings on that. But when I came back from Bangladesh, then I got very much involved. I returned to California and got involved in the farm worker movement with Cesar Chavez. I was in Delano, California. I joined Teacher Corps Vista and worked with the migrant workers, black and Chicano migrant workers in the San Joaquin Valley in California. And so, I boycotted a Safeway store and marched and all of those kinds of things. So I got involved in a different way. I returned to education. I did a master's at UCLA in English as a second language, and then I worked with bilingual teachers, teaching them bilingual methods of education. So I got a master's in English as a second language. And so I taught young teachers to work in that environment. Because I went to Bangladesh, I had a good sense of what culture was about. And of course I continued to learn more and read and studied. And so I had something to offer to these young teachers. Then I went, after that, after 1 year as a Teacher Corps Vista team leader, so I was a leader of 5 teachers in the San Joaquin Valley at a schoolhouse that was a one-room schoolhouse, one of those old-fashioned schools. And they had children up to the 8th grade in this one building, one little small space. It was probably about 1,000, maybe 100, maybe 1,200 square feet, which is relatively small. And so after doing that work, I went then into, I went to Stanford to start studying my doctor's degree in education. I was with that for several years, initially full-time, but then I married and started raising a family, and then I went part-time, and then decided that my strongest interest was not education, but it was the study of culture. So I left Stanford and then transferred to the University of California at Santa Cruz, and then essentially became a cultural philosopher. Did cultural studies there. And so this is something of the journey that I took in after leaving high school.
So you went to college for a major in English as a second language, right?
I went at Notre Dame. My major was history and modern languages, and the modern language that I did was Spanish. And so I did that as my undergraduate study. And then when I came back from Bangladesh, I had considered musicology. I've always been interested in music, but I really have no talent. So I had considered then, I was looking at colleges. I was accepted at the University of Hawaii to do musicology, but then I decided something more practical, to do English as a second language at UCLA. And there, of course, you can't do language without the study of culture. So I did a lot of reading. I did courses in UCLA. Mainly it was linguistics, and I did my theses in sociolinguistics. So linguistics, the study of language relative to society and to cultural groups. And so I looked at Black English. In other words, the English that is spoken colloquially, commonly by Black people, and as opposed to standard English. And I understood that this form of English had its own rules, its own grammar. It's structured as a language, and so it could be considered a dialect, or it could be considered a language, but it had its own formal rules for those who engaged in the language. So I studied that, and I studied teachers' expectations based upon whether a student spoke standard English or the black dialect of English. It's sometimes called Ebonics. Ebony, of course, is the word for black or associated with blackness, so it's called Ebonics or Black English. And so that was my study there. And so, and that was very satisfying. Then when I got a scholarship to go to Stanford, and the scholarship was in bilingual, dialectal studies. So I was in that for a short time. Then I transferred into anthropology in education. Anthropology, the study of humankind, the study of culture. So I was really moving in this area of culture. And then I transferred to University of California, Santa Cruz, where I finished my Ph.D.
And your Ph.D. was in cultural studies?
That's right.
Can you explain what you learned in that class?
What I learned in that class was how culture, that to understand culture, you have to understand culture in relationship to specific histories. So culture is constantly being created. Culture is constantly changing. And what changes the culture are the particular happenings and events. So the decisions that are made by groups of people, maybe groups of people in power, maybe the disempowered, their ways of thinking, their patterns of behavior, that creates the history. So if you are to understand any set of ideas, then you have to understand how those ideas participate in a particular history. So our languages change, and the meaning of our language changes as that history gives that language a different meaning because of the things that happen. So I learned about that relationship between the importance of context and how context, our history, shapes our thinking and shapes our language and shapes our behavior. But we are the ones that are doing that. It's not something outside of ourselves. So we are changing our language. We are changing the ways that we see things. So, like, for instance, the ideas of the 1960s and the ideas of 1940s and the way that people saw the world, their worldview, that changes. So it's different now in 2012 than it was 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So that's some of what I learned.
So what inspired you to become an anti-racism scholar?
I had been actually interested in issues of race from the time that I was a child with my grandmother. And around her house, I saw images of black people, and on the wall and in her bookshelf, and the company that she kept. She was a leader in her community. She was called Mother Hipsher. And she was a matron, a mother in a group called the Eastern Star. And this is a very historic, significant African-American women's organization, a kind of Masonic type of organization for black women. And so she had that identity within her community, and she would invite people over for dinner and so forth on Sundays. And so I had a sense of myself and of African American people that was really formed in the home of my grandmother. And so the books on her shelf, what she was reading, and I could read some of the simple poetry, some of the verses on the wall that I still remember now, one of which I could quote. So that formation, the music that she listened to, there's a famous singer by the name of Roland Hayes, and she had his music there. Later, Marian Anderson, who was part of this early civil rights movement as a singer, opera singer. So I had these images of people. So that, and also my friendship network of the diversity of peoples that surrounded me. And so I started thinking critically, probably about age 6 years old. And the story that was the story, a very simple story that kind of encapsulates this, is when I was in the 6th grade, the nun who was teaching the history, geography class that we were taking had us open our books to a particular page, and we were studying about the different peoples of the world, and she was presenting her theories about these different peoples. And one theory that she had was people who came from hot countries were lazy, and people who came from cold countries were intelligent and industrious, and the people who came from hot climates had everything given to them free, and so they didn't have to do anything, and they were lazy. And she pointed to a picture in the book in which a young person, maybe about 14, 15, or 16, was standing next to a palm tree, a date tree. It's actually a date tree that produces syrup, just like our maple trees produce syrup, same kind of thing. So this tree, there was a spigot into the side of the tree, a spout sticking out, and there was a bucket right under that. So the bucket that was there with the spigot was catching the syrup, and he was standing there. And she said, look at him. See how he's just standing there? He's lazy. And in my mind, I said, he's not lazy, he's working. He is working. He is waiting, just as a farmer. You know, the farmers can't plow their fields in the wintertime, and when in the wintertime you don't call them lazy because they're doing something else and not working in the fields, because they can't work in the fields, they do other things. And so what that did for me is to tell me that I had ideas that were different from the teachers, and I knew that my idea was right and hers was wrong. It's the first time I've ever had that kind of experience. So I was able to trust my own thinking and begin to question the thinking of my teachers. In part, I was being taught racist ideas, and I came to an awareness of that. I couldn't name it as racist, but I knew the ideas were wrong.
So you grew up in a mostly Latino black community?
That's right.
So at that time growing up, were you learning anything about Caucasians?
Yes. Actually, Andrew, still remember his name. He was the only white kid in our school at St. Leo's Elementary School in Willowbrook. And he was Sweden. His family had just come from Sweden. And we formed a very close relationship. And these people were dirt poor. They had just come from Sweden, living in a trailer someplace. I went to the house, and his mother would give me bread and so forth. And so I had a very close friendship with Andrew. In Seattle, I had very close friendships with whites, but my closest friend in Seattle was Filipino. And of course, when I was a brother, I was surrounded by white men. So in Notre Dame, I was surrounded by whites. There was, at Notre Dame at that time, when I was there in 1957 through 61, there were very few black people and very few Latinos there at Notre Dame. So mainly I was surrounded by white people, and certainly among my fellow students I had white friends and companions. And so I grew up in Seattle, and while in Seattle, I went back to Seattle in the 7th grade and 9th grade. I had the 8th grade elementary, the last year of elementary school, first year of high school, actually in Seattle. I stayed with my grandmother for those 2 years. She wished to have me there, So she asked my father and mother if I could come and live with her to help her out, you know, running errands, doing the hard work and so forth. But it was just a wonderful experience with her. And so I continue to have a diversity of friendships. But so I've had these friends, but it is a fact that the black and Latino friends were especially at St. Leo's Elementary School, these were the people that were closest to me. And the closest of my friends at St. Leo's, one was black and the other was Latino. When I went to high school, the closest of my 2 or 3 friends were black and Chinese.
So, as a child, have you ever experienced any acts of racism towards you?
As a child, yes, by and I'm not sure that acts in terms of ways of talking and worldviews that were racist that were being taught to me. I did not. I have not held on to memories in which I received direct, hostile, racist behavior. And see, part of that is that I was removed from that, and I was in pretty select environments. So when I was in Seattle in the 9th grade, I could identify behavior of a teacher, of a white teacher, both in the 8th grade and 9th grade, that would be ascribed racist, but it was mainly in the ideas of thoughts, that they would say things, expectations of me, what they thought of me by the way they treated me, but nothing overtly racist as using the N-word or hateful speech. It was more indirect kinds of things. So that's mainly what I experienced as a child. And so I had more awareness of what people were saying, their facial gestures as they said it. And sometimes, a memory that I have actually when I was 5 years old was anti-Jewish, was anti-Semitic. I could not have named it as such. My mother and I and little sister were coming back from Seattle. My older brothers and father had come from Seattle the year before, and the next year, so they set up the household and whatnot. My father got his business started. And then my mother, who was working in the shipyards, because this was still in the war years, she was one of those women who worked on the ships and so forth. She was a welder on a ship. And so we were coming, we had gotten off the train and had to get a taxi because one of my relatives was not able to come and pick us up. My father was out doing some work and couldn't pick us up, so she got a taxi. You have to understand that was a big, big deal to get a taxi. You know, that was a big deal. So my sister and I were sitting in the back seat with the taxi driver, and he looked up at the mirror and said to my mother, "My son and yours," he knew that my mother had older children, "my son and yours have to go to war, but the Jews, they don't go to war. They just pay someone, and their sons don't have to go to war." And I had never heard the word Jew before. But the look on his face and the intonation in his voice, I detected something. I didn't know what it was. It was actually hateful, a response to whatever these Jews were. I had no idea who they were. But now he told me there were some kind of people called Jews that were not patriotic. And for me, being patriotic was very important. Even at 5 years old, we had these war games, so I had some idea of the war. War was war. We were saturated with war. The movies, the comic books, rations, everything was about the war. It was a complete saturation into a culture that was focused on winning the war. And then he said, these Jews, they're not participating in the war. So it made a big impact. But not, it made me curious about the Jews. But it said something very much about him that later I was able to understand.
Well, I noticed that you had mentioned the phrase "as a child." Would that mean you had experienced more acts of racism as an adult?
Yes, and yes, and I would say the most egregious, hateful kinds of racism I tend to let go and forget, and that's probably important. And so I tend to be more impacted by the subtle kinds of things, subtle in behaviors and voice, treatment by people at the counter. I walk up to the counter, people precede me in the line, and whoever is there next, a white person in this case, comes, and the person behind the counter simply serves the person. When I come up, he says, "Who is next?" The interpretation of that is, I am serving a black person before I'm serving white people. So I have to justify my behavior, because the norm is whites are supposed to be served before blacks. So now I have to justify this and say I'm following the norm of serving whoever is next. Or sometimes it will be the tickets that are there. Sometimes they have these stubs. You can take a stub. And no one is paying attention to the stubs until I come. Then they want to check in on the stubs. And that's kind of subtle, but it's part of a norm of if it's white, it's right. If it's black, it should stay back. If it's brown, it can stick around. And so there is this hierarchy of race that is in the society, that is part of the nature of this society, that I become very much aware of. I could give you other instances of these kinds of subtle behaviors. Walking into the store, and I am greeted in such a way as to indicate that they are aware of my presence, that I am being watched. Other people, and I watched this in terms of I was aware of it in terms of around Christmas time, many people going into the store before me. So I'm walking up and people are going into this record shop before me. And the person is here. It actually happened here in the Twin Cities. The person is up here in the counter kind of overlooking things. And if people are going in, then when I come up, sometimes, in this case, they said, "Can I help you?" And so I oftentimes come into a store and I receive that kind of response. But they're not doing that to other people. So in other words, the message is, I know you're here. I'm watching you. I know you folks steal things, so I'm watching you. So you better be careful here. So it's those kinds of subtleties that I'm aware of, and they're not blatant.
Well, going back to your past, knowing what you do now, what would you do to try to stop racism from occurring today?
How would I try to stop racism that is occurring today? how would we eliminate racism from our society? How would we bring about a different society than we have today? How I'm actually doing this mainly is through education, but I know that that racism is more than just knowing. Racism is more than just being aware that racism is part of our history and part of our everyday lives. It's more than awareness and knowledge. It's more than having skills to deal with racist situations. It's also about a way that we live our lives, practices that we engage in, practices of thinking, practices of relationship. And so how can I bring about practices, especially in relationship? How can I help to bring people in relationship to understand each other? How can I help all of us to understand our common legacy of racism? So when I deal with these issues, I don't deal in terms of guilt or shame, as though somehow what we have inherited, this culture that we are surrounded with, this historical context that we are in that is shaping us, that has shaped our language, that has shaped our sense of relationship, of who we are and who the other is. We've been given this. We didn't create this ourselves. So why is there any blame to be given or guilting people, making people feel guilty about that? What's important is that we understand that this has been a legacy, that we have been socialized into this. We've been taught this, just as I was telling you the ways that I was being taught this. We've been taught this. We didn't ask for it. Whether it's the white person or the person of color, we've been taught this. We've been taught this through our media, through television, through comic books, through music, through our teachers, through our textbooks. We've been taught this. And so a part of it is acknowledging this history, is saying, yes, this is our history, and not being afraid to see the racism that is part of that history, to acknowledge the genocide against Native American people, the terrible conditions that still exist, that continue to exist for Native peoples in this state and in other places in the United States, to say that really happened, and there have been consequences that have resulted in poverty and violence within the family because of the boarding school system, to say that this is part of a history that came with the invasion of European peoples into this country and their enslavement of African peoples. And they're taking over, they're taking the lands from Mexico, creating a war, an unnecessary war, because they wanted slaves in Texas. So they created this war with Mexico, who would not have slaves in Mexico, in Texas. And so these wars that have to do with taking, exploiting resources so that the elite could become wealthier, and creating hostility so that, and creating ideas to justify these kinds of behaviors, saying that these are inferior people, they need to be brought to civilization, so we are doing them a favor. So teaching this history, teaching this legacy that we continue to live out. And so if we can have this knowledge and then learn how to relate to each other in different ways, then something can be done about racism. So this is what I do.
Do you believe the government is doing enough to support anti-racism?
Oh, clearly not. Clearly not. I'd say probably the very worst thing, the very worst failure of government is not supporting our schools. That's the worst. That's the very worst thing the government is doing, because we then we don't give people, young people, the resources to participate in the economy. They don't have the education necessary to participate. And even what is done, you know, when students are in school, what is actually taught in terms of young folks understanding who they are, what their capacities are, the positive expectations rather than negative expectations of youth because they're youth of color. So there are a whole lot of things having to do with education. I think our biggest failure in this country in regard to issues of race and racism is the failure to do something about our schools, and therefore continually letting students then drop out of school and have no future.
Who do you believe can make a difference in the government's effect on racism?
I think all of us can. You and I can. You at your school can, by what you are learning, by even through this interview and the ways that you come to understand how you are part of this society and what your own capacities are to bring about change in the people around you. Your capacity to see yourself as intelligent, as able, as empowered, and come to understand that you can make a difference not only in your immediate family, but you can make a difference in the community by the way that you use your intelligence and your education, that you can make a difference. And earlier I spoke about cultural transformation. So the way that you participate in this culture will help to bring about change. Culture is made up of patterns of behavior, and not only physical behavior, but especially mental behavior. So as you change your worldview or through your education here at River's Edge, the ways that you begin to see the world, and especially the ways that you develop critical thinking. Critical thinking is absolutely important. Being able to ask good questions in the ways that you're asking questions now, that get at the deeper issues. Critical thinking is really important, and that is what you can get from your education, the ability to examine, to understand, to question, and therefore to make an impact in the world and changing the patterns of thinking and behavior.
So, did these beliefs help you become the executive director and co-creator of the anti-racism study circles?
Yes, I think believing in my capacity to make a difference, and knowing that I am limited. So I'm not a Cornel West. I'm not a Martin Luther King. I'm just Herbert Perkins. Okay, so I try to understand the limitations of who and what I am, but to make use of that in the ways that I can. I have a lot of interests. Whatever my level of intelligence, if it were measured in terms of IQ, I don't know if it's 115, I don't know that it's 125, it's probably thereabouts. It's most likely not 160 or 170 or 180. Okay, so what is my intelligence? What are the things that I can do? There are a lot of things that I can do, but the one area that I have some particular skill in, where my various gifts come together, my interest in religion, my interest in relationship, I can use those in the work that I do in the anti-racism study dialogue circles, my gifts in education and creating curriculum, creating ways of studying these issues, I can make use of that. My gifts for relationship, my gifts for facilitating dialogue, my knowledge about culture. So all these various gifts come together in particular ways that I can use in the work that I do. You know, I can't do everything. I'm limited in many ways, but here's something that I can do. Here's where I can place my gifts.
So can you elaborate on what this group was designed for, or like what it does?
Yes. First of all, we understand, this organization understands issues of race, or I should say the issues of racism, as basically issues of relationship. Racism says that we are not in relationship. Racism might say that some people are superior, some are inferior, and there should be no relationship between them. Historically, if we looked at that idea, we would understand that this absence of relationship says that some people can treat other people as though they are not human beings. They can take their property, their lands, they can kill them, they can give them disease blankets, and this is okay because they're hardly human beings. And other people, they can go and they can take their labor, they can put them in their fields to grow their cotton, or grow their grapes, or grow their lettuce, and they can be underpaid, and they can be deprived of education and rights because the society is not in relationship to them, so we don't have to care about them as a society. There's no relationship. So the anti-racism circles is based on a sense of racism being about relationship. And so we then seek transformation. We seek transformation in the ways that people understand themselves, and transformation in the ways that transformation because they understand now something of the legacy of this country, and that they can mourn over this. They can have repentance over this. They can say, these things were wrong. These things actually happened, and I'm deeply disturbed that they happened, and I don't want them to happen again. I don't want them to happen around me. And so I'll take responsibility for this. I'll be accountable. I'll be accountable to the people who are impacted by these things that are wrong. And I will be in relationship with them. I will work with them to bring about this transformation. And so in this process of understanding and owning this legacy, then I can mourn, I can have sorrow over what was done wrong, and I can be empowered. Now that I understand, I can be empowered to bring about the changes that are within my capacity to do something about.
What advice would you give to somebody who would want to make a change in racism?
Be in dialogue with people who are impacted by racism. Be in conversation with them. Study the issues. Try to understand how racism is continuing. We're not in a post-racial society. Be critical in thinking about these issues. Try to understand what is behind the things that we see. If we see children of color not being educated, or coming out of schools with no education, or doing things that are antisocial, ask the question, what's behind that? What is causing that? You probably know the story of the people standing on a bridge and seeing the babies floating down the water, So they're standing, the water is flowing toward, they're on this bridge, the water's, and the babies, and they run down and they pick up a baby, and they run down and pick up a baby, and run down and pick up a baby. Someone says, maybe we should go upstream and see who is throwing the babies in the water and do something about that. So the critical thinking, looking behind things. If you see these things happening, just don't say, oh, these are bad people, this is part of their nature, or something like that. Or racism will forever be with us. We've always had racism. That's not true. So we just have to accept things as they are. No, go behind and see that things can change and that we can do something about the status quo, that racism was created in history, and in history we can undo racism. We can bring about the necessary changes.
Well, it seems like we've come to an end of this interview. Is there anything I haven't asked or something you'd like to mention?
Thank you. I just want to express my appreciation for your questions, and you have dared to ask questions that oftentimes they're not asked, and you've given good follow-up, and so I appreciate your having asked me to do this. You knew what my work was, and you invited this particular voice into your understanding something of the history that surrounds you, and I'm part of that history. I bring this history to the context of the West Side, and I'm so glad that you have asked me to share this with you. So thank you.
No problem, but we'd like to thank you for the time you were with us today, and we'd like to thank you for donating this video and this interview to the Memory Bank Project.
Thank you, and I will wear this t-shirt. Thank you very much.